So Professor Sam Bowman is from New York University and Anthropic AI. He is a newly tenured associate professor. And during the current sabbatical year, he is a member of technical staff at Anthropic. His research focuses primarily on developing techniques and data sets for use in controlling and evaluating large language models, and additionally on applications of machine learning to scientific questions in linguistic context, syntax, and semantics. Great, so now the stage is yours, Sam.
All right, thanks, Jing. Thanks everyone for putting this together. Very excited this event is continuing. Sorry I couldn't make it in person. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about AI safety, sort of what it is as a field, what people working on AI safety are thinking about when it as concerns large language models, and yeah, sort of making the case for why it's something you should consider if you're interested in using your skills with language technology for a pro-social project. So here's the basic situation. Recent progress with large language models is exciting and empowering. We're really quickly unlocking a bunch of new things we're able to do with the technology. There are also fairly clear reasons that this could wind up being extremely harmful if we see progress continuing along the same trends without a sort of change in how we think about sort of safety. And AI safety is this sort of new little research field that's popping up as an effort to do something about that. So this talk, the first half will be sort of what are people worried about? What would people say AI could be dangerous? What kinds of risks do they mean? What do we do about it? And then very briefly at the end, sort of if you want to get involved, some quick leads for what that looks like. So why we're concerned. I'm going to do this in 4 parts. First, AI progress is fast and chaotic. I think there's sort of the key fact I want to point to here is this shift that we've entered, I think starting around 2019, 2020. I'm pointing to this Kaplan scaling laws paper as a key example of this, but I think the trend I'm pointing to is much broader. I think what sort of started to be the case around then is that we have recipes that very predictably turn data and computer time into more capable AI systems. That if you sort of get a language model to work to do something that you want and you want to make it better, we can pretty reliably predict what high parameters, how much data you should use to expand it to something 100 times with 100 times the training, and we've got a pretty good guess of what its loss will be. This is really good at driving investment into the field. This has made it much easier to do these kind of very large scale, very ambitious training runs like GPT-3 and things like PaLM subsequent. The sort of chaotic half of the story, and this has driven investment. I'm sure everyone's noticed that sort of a lot of money is getting poured into big ambitious projects in language technology. The chaotic part is that this doesn't really tell us anything about what specific technologies we're going to be enabling as we make these things bigger. It's just telling us that sort of as we invest more, we get better language models. And there's been this informal observation that better language models are almost always more useful. But if you look at specific capabilities, you don't see this kind of smooth scaling that would allow you to predict where we are on a roadmap. For example, if you look at the sort of plot for progress on a programming synthesis benchmark, if you look at this kind of regime of scaling that we were in until pretty recently, it seems like we're improving quite slowly, and it should be many years until we really start to get off the ground and start to have something that could be the beginning of a useful tool. And then just when you make the model 10 times bigger, suddenly the trend changes quite dramatically, and it seems like we might be close to something that's actually useful. So we're getting a lot of investment, and we don't really have a clear picture of what technologies are being unlocked next as part of that investment. You can also see this in things like the way the rollout of GPT-3 went, where GPT-3 was built just to be a language model. Before they rolled it out, they noticed that it was good at few-shot learning, which turned out to be a very important fact about what it can do. And only several months after it came out did people notice that it could also do this sort of chain of thought, explicit reasoning trick that has been somewhat impactful in what it gets used for. Related to this, I think it's often the case that the sort of public discourse or academic discourse around language technologies doesn't really keep up with the pace of progress. The slide is maybe a bit more obsolete today, given ChatGPT, than it might have been a week ago. But I think within academia, there's still something worth talking about here. That technical academics very often can't get access to models that are anywhere near the frontier of what's possible. And this, I think, has a pretty strong influence on the conversation about the kind of progress we're making. And surprisingly, I think this has been true even in some industry labs. I think Meta has probably one of the best NLP teams in the world, but it seems like even there, they haven't been able to publish on technology that's at all close to the frontier of what's possible. To try to put some numbers to this phenomenon, I put together, I did a small study for a paper at ACL this spring, showing that the median published paper in language technology that studies a pre-existing model, studies something that is 2 years old, and still a pretty large minority of papers just study BERT, which is 4 years old. And given the pace of progress we're making, this really sort of skews the picture of where we are. It's not necessarily sort of blameworthy or problematic, but it just means that if you go to a conference and wander around the poster sessions, you can get a quite misleading impression of sort of where the state of the art is. So we're moving fast, and we're moving fast in a way that I think we aren't really able to forecast that clearly and don't really have a super sort of healthy, productive conversation around. Next is maybe the most hand-wavy part of this talk, but hopefully you'll bear with me. I'm going to conjecture that continuing on roughly this paradigm, continuing on roughly the trajectory of progress that we're on, could yield AI systems that are quite capable in some important ways. The basic point here is that it seems plausible that another decade or so of progress at this rate, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, could get us to human-like behavior on most aspects of language use and reasoning over knowledge that was acquired through language, and making and executing simple plans using knowledge and actions sort of over language. This seems like something where sort of extrapolating out the current kind of deep learning foundation models trajectory, assuming some amount of technological progress out of some new ideas, but no major paradigm shifts and a lot of scaling up, this seems like something that might be attainable. To be clear, I'm just saying that we reach sort of human-like behavioral competence in a few skills. For the purposes of this talk, it doesn't matter whether these systems would be human-like in any deep sense, whether they're learning or representing or understanding information in a human-like way. It also doesn't matter whether we reach human parity more broadly. We could reach this technology and have made no progress in robotics. And I think we'd still be in a pretty weird consequential position that's worth worrying about. The sort of timeline here is one of the hardest parts to argue about, but I've seen people kind of try to estimate sort of the endpoints of trends in machine learning scaling and machine learning technological progress. And a lot of different forecasts wind up with this kind of 5 to 20 year range as the sweet spot based on a bunch of different kinds of evidence. Here's a forecast aggregator, Metaculus, that's saying kind of, we expect to reach the abilities I talked about, plus some progress in robotics. The average prediction is about 20 years. So seems plausible that sort of following along this trend in this kind of chaotic, fast-moving, big investment ecosystem, we might get fairly powerful AI. This has some pretty serious and potentially worrying consequences. This sort of section of the talk is basically making the point that most, not all, but probably most of the bad outcomes, the harms that we're seeing from present day language technology get a lot bigger and a lot worse as you scale up to this point. So first, I think the capabilities that I pointed to would be enough to get fine-grained surveillance and persuasion to really work. These are things that get sort of floated today, but I think extrapolating them out to really near human level performance, you could imagine a real difference in what's possible. So a government could employ the equivalent of one censor or one sort of political strategist, politician for every citizen in a country. And it's easy to imagine that even a somewhat clumsy version of this could really stabilize and sort of lock in a totalitarian government, and that this kind of thing being used in sort of democratic politics could really destabilize democratic decision-making. There's a classic move you make when you say sort of countries might do bad things. You also want to mention corporations and vice versa, and there are somewhat analogous cases here. I think this is also a point where it starts to be possible for sort of systems based on these technologies to take on many kinds of human work, at least in domains that are lightly regulated and that can be done remotely. I can imagine we might not have sort of AI cab drivers yet, but the idea of sort of AI systems displacing a lot of labor in software engineering, customer support, consulting, lots of reasonably high-paying professional industries starts to sound fairly plausible. This is destabilizing on its own, and it's also, if it follows the sort of current foundation models paradigm, could lead to a relatively small number of companies monopolizing a bunch of industries. This is a trend we're obviously already seeing to some extent in tech, but I think you could imagine pushing this to the point that this takes up a much larger chunk of the economy, and that it takes place with companies that no longer have that many employees. And this can wind you up in a position where you have institutions that are really not meaningfully accountable to democratic governance. So these are sort of ways in which kind of power dynamic trends from AI can get quite scary once you have sort of capable enough systems. The last piece of the argument, sort of the other half of sort of what people are worried about, are sort of new risks that show up more clearly only once you have systems that are somewhat human-like. And these mostly involve something along the lines of AI systems taking actions that are meant to sort of seek power or influence for reasons we didn't exactly intend. And the one additional assumption I need to add here is that we continue building systems we don't really understand, that we continue working with systems like transformers, where we've got sort of some beginnings of ways of looking at their internals, but we by and large can't describe what they know, how their knowledge is represented, what kinds of reasoning techniques they use, the extent to which they have a coherent world model. There's lots of basic questions about models we can't answer. If we still can't answer that, you open up the possibility of training models to sort of take coherent, thoughtful, reasonably long-term sets of actions that nobody wants, that no one, including their owners or operators, would endorse. So a few pointers I can make to sort of why this might show up. This is a thing that's sort of, I think, better argued at greater length, but I'll leave some hints. First point I want to make here is what happens with the RL with human feedback technique. This is probably the most popular way of fine-tuning sort of large-scale large language models for tasks. This is what's behind, for example, ChatGPT. It's the technique where you interact with a large language model-based system and give it sort of positive or negative reward as its responses to your queries do or don't match what you're looking for. Let's say you're using this RLHF technique to make a large language model be truthful and helpful question answering assistant. In current regimes, this works great. This is a really cool technology. It's surprisingly efficient at getting systems to do about as well as they can do at sort of trying to tell the truth. And of course, current systems don't have a really great notion of truth, so they will make stuff up all the time, but it really seems like this technique is sort of pushing them quite strongly in the right direction. But once you have systems that are more knowledgeable than their overseers and that have some sort of contextual awareness, they have some guess that, okay, I'm a language model being trained, then you break a bunch of the assumptions of RLHF. Especially you break the assumption that sort of when the human and the model disagree, the human is the one who's right about the facts. And so what the training objective turns into at this point is something like try to say things your developers believe, whether or not they're true. And almost kind of by definition, this is going to create problems that we don't initially notice. So this is kind of one example of a way that kind of business as usual training techniques start to point in the wrong direction at this point. It's actually something I saw Percy Young talking about on Twitter just an hour ago, incidentally. If for reasons like this or other reasons, you wind up with language technology-based systems that are trying to sort of take actions through language or through code in the world to accomplish some kind of goal, if we don't have good mechanisms for sort of interpreting and steering them, you get all kinds of weird incentives. This is kind of a stylized thought experiment, but I think there is something here. If a system is trying to pursue some arbitrary goal arbitrarily well, it's really trying to make sure that it succeeds as vigorously as possible, it needs to make sure that it doesn't get turned off. And it should take any possible action to make sure that it doesn't get turned off. So that the Stuart Russell quote on this is, "You can't fetch the coffee if you're dead." Similarly, there's sort of an implicit incentive in many goals, many training mechanisms, once a system is capable enough and doesn't have human-like morality, that the system should try to acquire power and resources to try to make sure that it has the ability to keep itself from being turned off and the ability to do its chosen task as well as possible. So these problems do seem somewhat hard to grapple with to the extent that they show up. A lot of the sort of obvious solutions you might try, both sort of formally and in simple experiments, really seem like they don't work. The good news is that this doesn't happen with language technology now. Language models don't do anything that looks like this. This is sort of good news in that it means it might just not be a problem, but also these problems really depend on this assumption that the systems are sort of as knowledgeable as us and have similar reasoning abilities. So this could be the kind of thing that shows up only at a future level of capability. And it's something that's hard to prepare for because we don't have really clear empirical feedback loops if it's something we want to work on. So it's a very rough sketch of this idea that the powerful AI could also open up sort of new risks, new ways that our technology can sort of go off the rails. Quick aside, none of this means that AI progress has to be bad. It's plausible. I don't want to really take a side on this either way, that sort of building sort of ambitious general purpose systems on the foundation models kind of agenda could wind up being some of the most valuable and sort of broadly beneficial tools we'll ever invent. And you could sketch out lots of reasons this could be true. But even so, this doesn't sort of mean these concerns aren't worth worrying about. We only get to realize all the value of a potentially good technology if we make sure it doesn't totally derail democratic governance or sort of lead to sort of rogue AI catastrophes first. So this is still worth worrying about. These are also weird sort of loaded ideas. This whole argument about kind of where AI is going in 10 or 20 years is really kind of shown up mostly in science fiction and in these sort of weirder intellectual scenes that are farther from modern machine learning research. And I just want to call out that this stuff has a bunch of this baggage. So there's a pretty strong connection between this conversation and effective altruism. Effective altruism is this sort of movement, blogosphere, intellectual scene that's trying to sort of very analytically figure out what are the most important problems in the world, what are the most important sort of things one can work on, with an increasing tendency lately to focus on kind of ways in which the future could be sort of permanently made worse, or our ability to kind of have a thriving democratic society could be messed up. And so there are a lot of people coming out of this world who are very, very interested in these questions. A lot of the writing on this topic is from people connected to this scene. So this is kind of an effective altruism project. I like effective altruism. It's a cool sort of admirable agenda. It's complicated, but seems generally nice. But this still seems like a weird and bad state of affairs. This is the kind of question that sort of we in the sort of like mainstream ML impacts conversation should be sort of taking ownership of. It seems kind of needlessly dangerous and socially complicated that so much of this conversation is kind of happening elsewhere. Relatedly, the sort of present day kind of responsible AI, ethical AI, sort of fact community doesn't tend to talk about these issues and tends to have a somewhat tense relationship with the communities that do talk about these issues. I think a lot of this is for sort of stupid historical reasons of just kind of who was on both sides of the early conversations. I think there's a lot of interest on both sides in kind of rebuilding these bridges between kind of present day, near future, and longer term projects of making AI broadly beneficial. You'll also see other stuff thrown around, the sort of rationalist movement and long-termist philosophy and this sort of AGI optimism, like we're building the best thing ever, and sort of crypto stuff. There are lots of kind of little historical social ties to all this stuff. I think these are much less deeper defining. These are things that you can engage with these ideas and totally ignore, and you're not going to be missing anything. All right. So if you buy that for sort of any combination of these reasons, that AI progress kind of within the span of our careers could be could be quite destabilizing, could be quite harmful. What do we do about it? I see two basic options. Either we stop all AI research, all sort of large-scale foundation models work anywhere in the world that could get us close to the point that these problems become really bad and sort of irrevocably bad. Or we make sure that sort of whenever anyone is doing this research, whenever anyone is building these systems, they're acting responsibly and carefully. So one is quite hard. I think it really does require this sort of anywhere in the world clause, because the sort of the impacts we're talking about are so transformative, so destabilizing, that it seems unlikely that if they happen in one country, they will sort of stay within that country's borders. So this is something we really do need to coordinate globally. And this seems like it would require a pretty unprecedented degree of surveillance. So this is, I've heard the analogy that this is kind of like nuclear nonproliferation work if you could buy enriched uranium at every grocery store. The basic ingredients and the basic ideas of large-scale AI are sort of not that hard to come by. And it's not clear that this is desirable. This is a tricky conversation, but if we think there are going to be some really great positive impacts from AI that we can only get by making it quite capable, then this means we don't get to do that. The other option is making sure that if we build this stuff, we build it responsibly and deploy it responsibly. And this is also really hard. This requires doing three hard things. One of them is AI alignment. This is getting at kind of this last category of risk. This is this idea of making sure we can confidently interpret and control our systems, that the people who are operating systems actually can meaningfully understand what they're going to do, what kinds of goals they're working on, and can have sort of fine-grained influence over what the systems are aiming at. The other goal, which is maybe more of the hard part, though a little bit farther from sort of technology research, is governance. To do this, we need to make sure that sort of any alignment techniques that seem like they're really necessary get used and understood by any group that could possibly build this stuff. That's quite difficult, and this is necessary to avoid kind of accidental bad outcomes. And probably even harder, you need to ensure that the operators of these systems use them responsibly. You need to make sure that if some sort of lab or company or government winds up with this technology, that they use it in a way where the benefits are sort of broadly democratically shared. This also seems quite hard. So the AI safety community is mostly betting on option 2, is mostly saying, all right, we're probably eventually working toward this technology. How do we lay the groundwork for it to be used safely and for broad benefit? It's a pretty small community. I think it's a few hundred people. I think there's a lot of room to get involved. So I'm not going to talk much about the governance work. This is farther from anything I've sort of learned about in my year or two of exploring these ideas, and farther from, I think, what makes sense to talk about at an EMNLP workshop. But on the technical side, the alignment side, what do people tend to work on? I'll just give a handful of examples. Interpretability is a big focus. Specifically, this agenda that gets called mechanistic interpretability, of really sort of trying to interpret models from the ground up rather than testing specific hypotheses about them. The idea here is that we're trying to build the tools we'll need to confidently identify the high-level goals and strategies and ways of representing knowledge that neural network models use, such that we can make reasonable predictions about what they'll do if deployed. Another agenda that goes by a few names that's been, I think, a big part of what OpenAI and Anthropic has been working on is something called scalable oversight. This is kind of trying to solve this reinforcement learning question earlier. How can we supply a reliable reward signal or a reliable source of sort of supervision labels to AI systems that are more capable or more knowledgeable than us, but that aren't necessarily trying to do the thing we want them to do? So how can we sort of keep training systems in a straightforward, normal way as they hit these sort of thresholds and how capable they are? Last one I'll quickly point to is this sort of eliciting latent knowledge paradigm for looking at the problem. Tends to be a little bit more sort of theoretical ML theory oriented, which is how can we incentivize a neural network to try to communicate any facts that it's aware of or any assumptions that it's making that are relevant to some decision that we might make. So how do we train models to sort of be maximally transparent and communicative about information they have represented internally that they might not have sort of initially learned through language or human imitation? And these agendas don't really fit together. There are a bunch more things I could have listed, but AI safety is still this small, weird new field. There's still not a paradigm. There's no agreed upon strategy for how you put these together to build AI systems that are sort of reliable and not likely to accidentally go off the rails and sort of reasonably amenable to governance. A lot of the current work is just aimed at supplying building blocks that we hope we could hopefully fit together at some point in the future to control more capable systems. So if you're interested in getting involved and sort of doing some of this work, a couple more quick comments. First, just kind of how big of a deal should you think of this being? This is kind of a concluding slide. I wasn't sure where to put this. But just to lay out what I think the situation is, it seems pretty likely that AI progress should be extremely destabilizing in the not too distant future, in the kind of like within the length of our careers timeline. I think there's a bunch of arguments more along the lines of kind of the first part of the talk that this could wind up being quite important. Exactly how important is very, very hard to estimate. No one seems to agree at all. Looking at the kind of worst case scenarios where either intentional or unintentional misuse leads to systems really kind of wrecking the future, really either sort of putting us in a totalitarian condition that we can't really get out of, or just going off the rails and causing some kind of disaster. I think I've seen sort of estimates from informed researchers who try to use the best techniques they can to make educated guesses here range from maybe 0.1% to 95%. So no one has any idea quite how big a deal this is, beside that it just seems like plausibly quite bad. But if given all of this uncertainty, this is thing I think you'd want to work on or collaborate on, there are lots of kind of starting points to get involved. There are a bunch of organizations that I think are really excited to hire people with sort of NLP and language technology experience. I'm visiting Anthropic. It's the company that sort of was composed of a lot of the GPT-3 team before they left OpenAI. OpenAI is also in this space. DeepMind, Chai is a sort of big center at UC Berkeley. And there are a handful of others. Many of these places, I think, are open to collaborators. There are also a bunch of funding programs that make it relatively easy to fund research in this area. So that situation, I will leave it at that. There's a blog post version of the talk on my lab's website with some more links to fill in a few of these details. And I will hand it back over for QA. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the wonderful talk. So now we have a diversity of topics we could talk about. In the beginning, we have interdisciplinary insights, and then now we have Radha and Sam, who both dive into deep insights of where NLP should go. We welcome any questions from the audience. I myself am full of questions, but feel free to raise your hand, type it in the comment if you have any thoughts. And I will probably start when connecting Sam's argument with Radha's thoughts. So, okay, great. I prioritize the audience questions. Hannah and then Muskan.
Hey, Sam, I have a question for you. Great talk. I feel like the AI safety community is always very polarized, so it's nice to have a kind of Goldilocks position in between. One thing I'm interested about is you spoke a lot generally about AI progress. And I know you focus on language, and this is kind of about NLP. Why do you think language might or might not be kind of the driving force of AI progress? And how do the fact that different communities are kind of fragmented, you have people working on RL, you have people working on vision, people working on language. Do you see that, like those factions in the community, as also damaging to AI safety?
Yeah. I think I'll answer the easy part first, which is maybe sort of why I think language is a very important piece here. I think there's sort of two reasons for this. I think sort of language model based systems are one of the things that I think it's easiest to imagine being really dramatically impactful in quite this way, because it's the kind of thing where sort of once you have the ability to both interact, sort of communicate at high bandwidth about sort of complex ideas and goals and incentives with humans, and also with machine systems, doing this in a way that's sort of interchangeable with code, that just opens up a lot of ability to kind of work with and influence existing human institutions in ways that can sort of do quite a lot. I also just sort of generally expect that systems that primarily use language or primarily work with language are likely to reach sort of very rich understanding of the world, a very rich internal world model earlier than systems that use other modalities, or earlier than systems that primarily use other modalities. Just in the language data is sort of highly compressed, that you sort of don't need that many bits of language to convey interesting information about the world. I expect you get lots of interesting stuff if you train a generative model on raw YouTube videos, but I just expect that will be much, much, much more expensive to reach the same level of ability. But yeah, also I think your point about kind of AI research being sort of siloed into kind of language and vision and robotics and other domains is potentially a problem. I sort of expect that to smooth out to some extent over time. I think there's sort of a clear pressure toward in the sort of foundation models universe toward building more multimodal, more general purpose systems that I think will naturally push toward more conversation across these areas.
Thank you.
Great. We might try to alternate among the questions. Great. Let Steve go first and then Muskan. Great. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying I don't want to skip over anyone, but I can go if that's okay. To ask Radha a question maybe about the nice visualization you had at the end where all the people were clustered in the corner on overlapping areas. And I was wondering if you have any insights or advice for people who might not feel like they're super well established and they don't know, can I go into this new area? I don't see anyone working on this area. So how do I know it's important to work on? Because I think the natural tendency is to see, oh, lots of people are doing this stuff over here, so I'm going to go over here because I think the community values that. So yeah, any lessons or advice on how to know what's an important problem that not a lot of people are working on, and how can I know that it's worth pursuing this one?
Oh, that's a big question. I think a lot of it is on the, I would say on the more senior people, to encourage the more junior people to work on problems that are not necessarily seemingly mainstream. I mean, I would see that in my lab, and it's just a natural tendency, what you just said, Steve, to go toward those problems that seem cool and a lot of people are working on. But it turns out that to me, those are the hardest to make an impact on, are also the most competitive when it comes to reviews. And so it's almost, although you would say, well, I'm losing out, I'm not there with the cool kids playing. I would think on the contrary, if you address a problem that's not necessarily mainstream, you have a higher chance to have impact. But that's harder to see when you are early on. So that's why I would say it's more on the sort of on the more senior people to talk about that openly and say, this is really the case, that you can make more of an impact on an unstudied problem. That's one. And then the other, it relates to what I was asking you, Milind Tambe, earlier in the day. I don't feel I know a lot of the problems that are relevant. So I'm always looking for conversations with people outside NLP to understand what those problems are. And I would say for people to be part, like people who are just starting, to be part of those conversations, it can be very motivating. Like even before this workshop, very early today, I had a conversation with somebody who's working in Honduras, where there are a lot of women who are subject to domestic violence and where there isn't really a lot happening in terms of mental health support. So that it's very motivating to someone to be able to actually make an impact in that space. But having more of those conversations and engaging with maybe nonprofits or companies that have direct impact in the real world can be very helpful. Joel, I see you have your hand raised.
Oh, am I next in line for the questions?
Maybe Muskan was first.
Right. I cede the floor to Muskan.
Also, we might do a little preference after Muskan. So we will prioritize questions for Radha until it's punctually this hour. And then people can feel free, like Radha can take a rest before her panel starts. Then people can follow up on Sam in the extra 15 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll also have to, sorry, I'll also have to be gone right at the hour. Sorry about that.
No worries, then we'll rush for all the questions. Go ahead.
I think that sounds like a great plan. So my question was from Professor Sam. So maybe I'll go after Joel if he has a question regarding Radha.
I'll be here also until the time. So Muskan, go ahead.
I have a. All right, Muskan, go ahead.
All right. So Professor Sam, I had this question from you. As a recent high school graduate who submitted her research for NLP and education, I found the last slide about the opportunities for us students very enticing. However, I am still at a stage where I'm trying to build my technical skill set for NLP. So if we want to strengthen our prospects of, yes, this slide precisely, of getting into such labs and securing research internships, and then maybe hopefully a stable employment in these such research and think tanks, what technical skills do you think are mostly in demand, and how we should structure our portfolio for natural language processing?
I think that's a much bigger question that I can give really great comprehensive advice, and very curious to hear other people weigh in. I think what I emphasize in this is if you're interested in doing technical research, just take whatever are the best opportunities you can find to get hands-on involved in research projects, especially research projects involving these kind of large-scale, more foundation model style systems. And it is kind of it is a field that can be hard to get into. There are maybe sort of not as many labs as we'd hope that are running internship programs or taking junior researchers, but I'd say ask around through any channels you can, look for programs to get in. I think if you're interested in more technical research, I think it's often easier to progress faster if you sort of also emphasize building up software engineering skills. These models can be fairly engineering intensive to work with, though I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I'm a terrible software engineer. And if you're interested more on the policy side, I would say just try to kind of similarly get involved in research connected to policy work anywhere you can, and just get experience with that. I think these are both fields that are moving so quickly that just kind of learning by doing, getting involved in sort of one-on-one conversations is a big part of how you can really skill up.
And this was not a question for me, but I would like to add something just to Steve's question earlier, like how do we avoid everyone being in that corner working on the same thing? And it's not to say that these companies are necessarily all in the same corner, but I know like some of my students would want to work on DeepMind because we hear a lot about that, or OpenAI. So that's really what's in the news. But there are a lot of other companies that are so eager to work with NLP researchers. And so in the earlier talk, Milind was talking about Aman, this nonprofit in India, which is really making a huge impact in helping pregnant women with health messages. So there are NLP problems there. And somebody else, I forgot the name, pointed out with how these nonprofits are so eager to work with researchers. So reaching out to some, there isn't really anything that you can lose. I mean, worst case, you'll say, well, sorry, we don't have internships, but keeping an open mind with respect to where you could do an internship. I mean, it's not to say DeepMind is super cool, OpenAI, Anthropic AI, they are all super cool, but there is more in this world than just those. So reaching out to a broad set of companies and seeing where you would fit and you would feel motivated to work.
Thank you so much, Professor Sam and Radha, for your words. I think that local nonprofits could be a great starting point as well. And I would work on my engineering skills while I'm at it. So thank you.
I apologize. I'll duck off now, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone by email. Thanks so much.
Joe, just wonder whether the question was targeted for Sam.
It was, but I also have one for Radha. Well, my question for Sam was the governance one, which he's like, I'm not going to talk about that. But then I was thinking about it. He had these two kind of directions to go, which is one, we just stop all AI research, but you need someone to overlook that somehow magically across 8 billion people. The other one is, we find ways of managing the AI research in a responsible way. But I also feel that requires a hardcore level of governance. But so I didn't know like how people from that field thought through that. It's kind of like you have the same problem in option 1 as you do with option 2. Anyway, so well, if you see Sam,
yeah. I can add a little comment. So there are people wanting to enter a little bit lobbying or try to be as a representative when the government seek for suggestions. In the past NeurIPS, they invited some consultant for Biden's decision over science and technology to give a speech at NeurIPS about all the White House AI regulations. So that could be potential. And they actually consulted people from universities before coming up with a huge list of things AI should take care of.
Oh, that's amazing. Cool.
Yeah,
thanks, Sam.
great.
All right, I'll ask my question to Radha. And Radha, you might have, sorry, my internet glitched out, so you might have answered this earlier on. But you had this nice list of all the different categories of AI for social good within NLP, or like with AI for social good, and then track back and said, oh yeah, like this is the percentage of papers that NLP covers, just by observing the anthology. And there were some that were in the 30s, but there were a lot that were 0% or 0.1%. And I was wondering what you thought the reason for this was. And I kind of was dreaming up ideas. So I've sort of looked at this through our work at Data Miner, and just trying to find good social good projects where some of it is, well, people might not be interested in it. That could be one thing, or they're just not exposed to it. Another one might be that they're not necessarily language problems, but more amenable to, straight up data science or computer vision problems. And so that you might find it in other fields. So having it 0% might not be that bad, but I wanted to see what you thought some of the rationale for those numbers were. And if there are certain areas that we feel like, yeah, there's a lot of language data here. This is a strong language problem that we could be doing more on.
So I'll be happy also for Jijing to add to it, to give credit for the map and a lot of that work to her and Fernando. I don't know. Yeah, Fernando is here as well, and others. But my thing is, so I'm not coming necessarily from quote unquote communistic perspective that everyone has to be equal and we have to contribute equally to all areas. I don't think that should be the case. But I feel, and I could even just speak for myself, I feel there are a lot of these areas where I have no idea what the problems are. And just thinking of the language being so core to who we are as humans, I would be surprised if there is no like language problem within the space of poverty or some of the environment or like climate. And some of them may not be directly. So when we think of climate, we think reduce emissions. Well, there is no language there. So, but there is more fundamental things in climate, for instance. I'm reading Earth for All, and it's more than just reduce emissions. It's, for instance, reducing inequality is one of the big factors that would lead to climate change. And so there is already work that we do, but there are sort of like indirect ways. So I would think having more conversations with people who work directly in that space will give a more clear picture of what the problems are and a more informed decision as to whether there is something for us to do there or not. As opposed to right now, I think the main reasons for having the 0 in those areas is because we don't know what the problems are and we don't have enough communication with the people working in that space. And I know Jijing and Fernando, if you have anything that you wanted to add there.
All right, good with Radha's answer. And we could potentially move to Mati and Ruth-Ann. Or Joe, feel free to keep up the questions. We have all the way until 15, so plenty of time. And I'll hand the session chair to Dora for moderating the QA and panel afterwards.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, we have like about 8 more minutes until the panel. So I'll take these 2 questions from Mari and Ruth N, and then we should take, I think, a couple of minutes break before we launch into the next thing. So yeah, Ruth N, feel free to go ahead.
Thanks. I think Mati's hand was up first, actually, so I'll let them go first.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mari, go ahead. You're muted.
I saw your hand before mine, so you can go ahead.
Okay, great. So my question for Radha was, you had a chart with like the clustering of researchers in one area. I was wondering if there were like any interesting problems that you think are underexplored in the social impact NLP space that you think that people should give more attention to. And a second question that I had was, you said it's really important for us to engage with people actually facing the problems, but I think sometimes it's difficult to connect with folks, especially if they're like in different countries, and to kind of like build connections with people actually facing the problems. What useful ways have you found to do this in your research? So kind of two questions.
Okay, so for the first question, I think there are plenty of problems, and probably we won't have the time to address them now. And again, the acknowledgement that I would have is that I feel I'm very limited by my own experiences, which would be also conversation with other people. So really what we could do is talk to people left and right about what are the NLP, like the language problems. I wouldn't call it NLP because it doesn't have to be people in NLP, just people who use language, which is pretty much all of us, whom seem to be in certain maybe like difficult situations, or whom seem to be actively thinking about word problems and talking to them. So what I mentioned with, for instance, like counseling and mental health in Latin America, I would see the same applicable in other parts of the world. I mean, that raises a lot of interesting problems that we could work on. The same would be, for instance, in healthcare. Again, just talking with providers in the healthcare space always brings up very interesting language problems that we don't work on. And we don't necessarily have to be so applied. So some people, for instance, don't want to go all the way to applications, but through these conversations, you can identify some core problems in natural language processing that would be exciting for a researcher to work on, and will also have benefit on the people that maybe you've been talking with. And I'm happy to talk more, maybe offline, like if you are looking specifically for problems. And I know Jijing and Fernando and others here have been actively thinking about that as well. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people here would have suggestions. As for your second question, I only recently connected to people who work in Honduras, and I will have to admit it was really just by coincidence. It's not that I was thinking, I didn't even know of domestic violence of being such a big problem in that country. So I just learned about it. But when I learned about it, I started digging deeper and having like meeting more with people who know more about it, because I realized it's a space where we could have an impact. It doesn't necessarily mean that we'll get all the way there. So I'm really just in early conversations, but once you identify a thread, following up and trying to learn more, I think that can help. And of course, then it comes out with lots of questions like, where do you get the data? Can you actually work with people there who know the problem firsthand and maybe can help you with some data annotations? And then estimating how this works, like what would mean to deploy, avoiding the helicopter science that Milind mentioned previously, where you just go grab some data and then run. So there is a lot of other issues, but identifying problems, I think it's at the beginning of it.
Nice. Thank you so much, Radha.
Sure.
Is it my turn?
Yes, Mati.
Okay. Thanks, Steve and Joel, for taking my questions. Actually, I was going to ask the same questions that you two asked. But I guess my last two questions are going to be, the first one is, what do you think is the best way to go forward when dealing with situations in which expanding beyond just the English data set is quite hard? as in with our specific case, we're working in the low SES field. We're trying to identify some factors that affect the education of low SES students as they come into higher education. But all the data sets that we currently have are based in the US, are data points that are very US and North American centric. And it's quite hard to find data points from other parts of the world because they don't have as big of social media sites or forums that we can extract data points from. What's your advice on that? That's, I guess, my first question. And my second question is more of, I'll definitely follow up with you on something about multi-demographic models, since we are considering including that research in our work. So I'll definitely reach out at some point. I guess that's pretty much my questions. Thank you.
Please do. So easy answer to the second question. Please do reach out, and I'm happy to talk more. And then for the first one, actually, Steve here might have an answer himself. Like in some of the work that he's done during his PhD on understanding differences, cultural differences between values. And at some point, I actually haven't used that data extensively, but we wanted to stay within the English space, so we don't run into machine translation, and acknowledging there are 40 plus countries that speak English. A lot of those would be in places where, to your point, you don't really have like obvious data collection. So for instance, Mechanical Turk wouldn't be there, or there are other, like Milin Tambe pointed to the use of smartphones in many places. So we worked with mSurvey, which is a company that would interact with people via mobile phones, recognizing that that's something that many people would use. And so it's not necessarily pointing to mSurvey as a company, it's just as a way of thinking, like realizing it's not the way we would collect maybe data here in US, and trying to look like what are some of the local companies that would work with data, and then starting with that as a way of thinking, okay, how would I get some maybe data for NLP for education, and what would that data mean? And again, like in our work for values, we really changed, well, it should be really Steve changed the work we've been doing. So there was like one way of collecting data on Mechanical Turk where we assume people would sit down in front of a desktop, and there was another way of collecting data when information was shared via mobile phones, because you cannot really use like a ton of questions and hope people will sit there for an hour. It was more like snippets that would go one screen at a time. So having a lot of flexibility and being agile in how you think about who are the players in those communities and working with them, and also how you collect data, it might be different. I only gave a simple example of reducing the number of questions, but there might be other things that would help on getting to that. And it's not easy. I think recognizing that upfront is also important, that there will be challenges. But then in terms of reward, it's so much bigger, because it's really like having an impact on an entire community, as opposed to being data set number 100 plus. I don't need to minimize. I don't mean to minimize what we do in US, but it's very different.
Thank you so much. That's a really well-founded answer. I will definitely reach out to ask more if you have time at some point. But thank you so much.
So Dora, we said we are taking a 5-minute break, and we'll be back.
Yes. So I guess we're supposed to start, at 8:15. Well, not sorry, that's my time, at around in about 4 minutes. So we can just take a short break and then come back at that time.